All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How you doing? Are you new? If so, hi, welcome. Everyone else, it's one of those weeks, y'all. It's one of those weeks where I'm making this happen by the hair of my chinny chin. It's like a last minute situation here. Honestly, about 20 minutes ago, I was falling asleep because I was in my backyard working on the fence all day in the hot sun, 90-degree hot sun, working my ass off. And I have no energy. I'm very low energy. Not usually the kind of energy level I would want to be bringing to this intro, but what are you going to do? Show's got to go on, and sometimes you do what you got to do. You make it happen, right? I'm sure you're doing that in your life in lots of areas too. So, here we are. And I have a wonderful story actually for you about working on the fence today. But I'm going to save it for the other side of today's conversation. So if you want to stick around to the other side, I got a little story about the fence. For now, I just want to introduce you to today's talk with Sally Kempton. If you've been around for the last few weeks, you have probably noticed that there's a very particular thread that I've just been pulling on. I keep asking everybody about it. And it has to do with this idea of there being a mystical realm or not. And what people really believe. Like, what do yoga teachers actually believe? Because there's a lot of things that are in yoga teachings. Even something like the subtle body. You hear about that in yoga circles, I'm sure, if you've been around them. You hear this talk of the subtle body, or my yoga therapy friends always talk about the Panchamaya Kosha model and these layers, right? So when we get to the subtler layers, it's not always very clear what we're actually talking about. And sometimes I think that when we're talking about subtle body experience, we're talking about experiences that don't really fit into our normal ways of thinking about things or talking about things even. Certainly not something that is generally explained by scientific studies as of yet. Or maybe they never will be. Maybe they're not to be defined in that way because they function on another plane? I don't normally like to talk about this stuff, and I think very few people do. And yet, I know I've had experiences that seem to go beyond what would be considered rational explanation, and I'm betting a lot of other people have, because I think that yoga practice often does lead to these kind of experiences. So I've just been wanting to find people who will talk to me about it. Like, what do people really think? And there are not a lot of teachers out there who teach anything directly about this unless you find like a Tantra teacher like Sally Kempton today. So I was very glad to get this chance to talk with Sally, to probe her some on like the difference between ascetic and householder paths, and to just ask her about this kind of stuff and see what she would offer us. And I think you will hear there's a lot there. So I'm very grateful to Sally for having given me this opportunity, and I'm glad that you're going to get to hear it today. But before we get to that, I have some talks that are going to be coming to you in a few weeks that have to do with like the current state of affairs for independent yoga teachers and the relationship between yoga centers and yoga teachers, and yoga teacher trainings and what Ryan Cunningham from Unrolled Podcast called the pre-existing ruse. But in the meantime, if you've been around, you've heard me talking about Moonclerk, which is what I use to process recurring and one-time payments for all of my stuff. And if you've subscribed to this podcast, if you've done my live stream classes or my teacher's call or bought my on-demand workshop or videos or any of my stuff, if you've gotten any of my stuff, in the last couple years, you have used Moonclerk, and I'm sure you could see for yourself that it worked seamlessly. And before I used Moonclerk, I used lots of other payment processing services, and it didn't work so smoothly. So I couldn't be happier with Moonclerk. And if you are an independent teacher who's doing classes out of your living room, or now you're doing hybrid classes maybe, and you've got your own thing going and your own email list, which I really think you need to, then you also need to have your own way to do the billing. And I don't know what you're currently using, but I want to suggest to you that Moonclerk is likely better. So maybe you'll check it out. Maybe you'll just see for yourself. You can do me a favor and let them know that I'm sending you by going to jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. That's jbrownyoga.com/MOONCLERK. jbrownyoga.com/Moonclerk. Go check that out. Let me also give a shout out to some Podcast Premium subscribers, because it's through the support of Podcast Premium subscribers that I'm really able to keep doing this the way that I'm doing it, y'all. So thank you to Sarah Collin and Catherine Murphy for being Podcast Premium subscribers. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, we have a Podcast Premium subscription, which is a way to have access to the full archive of the show, which has gotten pretty extensive. And it's just a way to help support us in doing it. It's choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. If you don't have any money right now and you were hoping to listen to one of those old episodes, all you have to do is email us and we will give you a free account with no questions asked. But if you're in a position to give something, it matters. It's how we are able to keep an independent media like this going. So thank you to everybody who's doing that. If you want to get some information about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber or any of the other stuff I mentioned, any of my live stream classes or teacher's call or any of my other stuff, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I actually did summon a little bit of energy there, didn't I? I reached in deep and I found a little. But I think that's all I got for now. And that's just fine and good. Like I said, I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and let's get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Sally Kempton. Hello?
Hi.
Hi, Sally.
How are you? Are we doing audio or video?
Oh, we're doing audio, but I can turn mine on just to say hello because yours is on.
Hi.
I don't know about you. I tend not to like the audio on as much. I find it a little bit distracting. If you want to keep yours on, I can turn mine off and you can keep yours on. It's up to you.
The video, no, it's fine. Where are you?
I am in Pennsylvania, in Easton, Pennsylvania, about an hour and 45 minutes outside of the city.
Okay.
Just on the other side of the Delaware River.
Yeah, I grew up in Princeton. I know.
Okay. So you know where it is.
Yeah.
I moved here in 2017. I was in Brooklyn for like almost 20 years prior to that, or 15 years in Brooklyn and then like 5 years in the city.
Right. So what made you decide to move to Pennsylvania?
Well, I had a yoga center that I had for 10 years that did fine for 7 before the gentrification did me under and I couldn't keep up. So that last 3 years was rough. I have a wife and 2 children. So I made a big shift in 2017. I put a bunch of stuff online, which was fortuitous for me, frankly. And I traveled a lot. I did kind of like the international circuit some.
Nice.
Well, until the world shut down.
Well, everything felt, yes. Until everything changed. Yeah.
All right,
how do you like Pennsylvania?
I have come to really love it. It's worked out great for us. It's really all been about this house that we're in. That it's funny, again, I reached out to you, talk to you, and I wanted to talk about mystical realms, which we could get to later. And just so you know, I am already recording. Okay.
Okay. So let's get on with it. And
all right. So I'm going to turn my video off, and you can turn your video off too if you want, or you can keep yours on if it's up to you.
Okay. Here we go.
Yeah, I think for me, I've spent a lot of time on Zoom calls these days. I don't know how much you do.
A fair amount, yeah.
And I'm become very accustomed to, having the videos on, and there's certainly something nice about that. I'm glad we actually had a few moments there. But now when we turn it off, for me personally, I just listen to your voice, and I'm not also scattered in my energy about other things in terms of like how I look or how you look.
I know it's it's distracting seeing yourself as one does on Zoom. So I get it.
Very cool. Well, I was saying to you that I have come to really love Pennsylvania, and mostly it was because of this house that we stumbled into. And I really feel like there were like forces at work that made it happen beyond my ability to fully comprehend. And that is part of what my motivations to reach out to you were about, was to discuss such things.
You want to talk about race.
But before we jump into all of that, I want to just ask, where are you?
I'm in Carmel Valley, California, on the Monterey Peninsula.
Okay. And how long have you been there? Is that like where your home base is?
Yeah, I've lived in this house for about 10 years. Before that, I lived in Carmel itself, or in an area in Carmel called the Carmel Highlands. So I've lived in this area since 2003.
Okay. Well, let me just thank you for giving me your time. I really appreciate it. We've never met, and I've never even studied with you, but I certainly know of you, and you represent some very important things for me. And so I just appreciate that you are giving me this time. And also just to say, like, today is such a better day for me than last week. So I'm almost glad it didn't happen last week and we're speaking today. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's my pleasure. What does J stand for, by the way?
J stands for Jason.
Jason. So, but everyone calls you Jay?
Pretty much my life. Most of my friends call me Jay. And when I first got to New York, there was another Jason Brown who was a yoga teacher. And so I was also writing quite a bit. Like I had a lot of blog writing I was doing. And I started putting J period because I thought it looked cool. And it sort of stuck. I've just been using it ever since.
Okay.
It's a little eccentric of me, but I've come to like it for that reason, because I always thought Jason Brown was such a vanilla name.
Oh, I think it's a great name. But I understand. There's another teacher whom you probably know named Jeff Brown, whom I just came across.
Yes,
so,
I don't know him personally, but I am familiar with him being out there.
Yeah, so there's quite a few Jay Browns in the world.
Yes, I suppose that's fine by me, you know. Yes. But I am so glad to speak to you. And I mentioned that you represent some things for me.
And what are they? I'm always curious.
Yes. I was going to share, because I'm not trying to put a whole bunch on you or anything. It's just when I came to yoga in the early 90s in New York City, yoga was still kind of a very underground thing. It hadn't really hit mainstream quite yet.
Right.
And there was sort of a couple of different models for like paths in yoga for Westerners at that time. And one of those paths was to like go be like in community, like go live in an ashram and become a devotee.
Right.
And I thought about it for a while. I even like tried to do some like homemade DIY version where I was like celibate for a few years and like tried to be a monk while living in a basement apartment in the Lower East Side. Didn't work out so great for me.
No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work out so well. That
no.
So I represented the path of ashrams, and
well, not just that path, because the other sort of path that there was also these sort of rogue people like Sharon and David at Jivamukti, where I first started taking classes, who they were still giving a lot of reverence. Like they had pictures of the gurus up on their altars,
right?
But they weren't like monks,
right?
They were like the tattooed rocker people in the East Village.
Yeah, I know Sharon and David.
So I gravitated there. I was a tattooed rocker person in the East Village too.
Got it.
So it made sense for me. But I did try, and they were still teaching what I would think of as it was a weird mix, honestly, because they still were teaching what I would consider kind of like ascetic principles that didn't really jive. That's why trying to be a monk in the Lower East Side, my apartment really wasn't working because there was something that didn't work there.
Right.
So in any case, I eventually took this trip to India. I met a Swami there who presented a very different idea of yoga, which I later learned to be a tantric idea about yoga.
Right.
Which is really what helped me find a way that made sense for me.
Right.
So you, having spent 30 years as a monk and now being what I would consider a very well-regarded and esteemed Tantra teacher, you represent someone who's lived what I only had a little taste of and what I've still been having to kind of reconcile for myself.
Yes. I've split the difference in these paths for sure.
Mm-hmm. So here, let me start it off. Let me ask you a question about your 30 years of being a monk. Is that right? It was 30 years. Did I get that right?
29, actually. But
29. But yeah, close enough.
Pretty much right, yeah.
So my curiosity about it is that to me, there's a very fundamental difference between these paths. And when you were a monk, was the purpose behind all that practice you were doing and all that life that you were leading, was that for your own personal liberation or enlightenment, or was that out of some idea for the collective good, or was that all in service to the guru?
Pretty much in service to the guru. So I don't want to give you the entire chapter and verse of my journey. I'm actually in the middle of writing a book, which is partly memoirish, really about these issues. So I'm very steeped in, what made me make the decisions I made back in the 70s. I'd had an awakening due to a psychedelic drug, and if you've ever heard me speak, you know this story. It's one of the stories I tell a lot, and about a year and a half after that experience, I found myself at one of those life crossroads where you have to make a change and you can't do it on your own. I think similar to what you're talking about. So I got involved in a Western spiritual group, which was kind of the beginning of my spiritual education. And in the midst of that, I had a Kundalini awakening, and it coincided with Swami Muktananda coming to the States for his second world tour. So this was in 1974. I went to meet him. I had a radical experience of my heart opening, which was, kind of on point for, I guess, what I was most deeply looking for in understanding my path, because I'm very much on a heart love, devotional path, though I wouldn't have named it that at that time. And I also had a feeling, and it's very hard to describe, but when I walked into the room where I first saw him, this thought came into my mind: this is why I was born. And so pretty much from the beginning, I had a series of kind of dramatic spiritual experiences in the early days, my early days around him. But and I joined his second tour, essentially, as an adventure. I didn't make the decision, okay, I'm going to follow this man forever. But there was a moment about 6 months later when I had to make a choice between returning to my life, which, I was a journalist. And I actually called up a couple of, actually the New York Times Magazine, got an assignment and was just about to, return to my apartment, which was being sublet, and do this piece for the Times and restart my journalism career. And then I had this moment of realizing that Muktananda was, I thought he was very old at the time. He was younger than I am now. But I thought he's not going to live much longer. He is, genuinely transforming my psyche. And therefore, I'm going to stay with him. And so I did. And at a certain point, he began talking about giving initiation into sannyas, the Indian monk path, to a group of Westerners. I very much resisted it. I'm like you, I'm kind of a counterculture person. And it was not so much the renunciance life that I resisted as the idea of putting on a uniform and being identified with an organization, which is very much not my style. But after a couple of years of thinking it through and going back and forth with it, I agreed to do it, and it felt like that. I was agreeing to it. So he gave me initiation into sannyas about 6 months before he left his body. And what I subsequently realized was that the reason he had insisted that I do this, and because I was very much on a guru-disciple path, I did it for him. I did it because it seemed like that was what he wanted me to do, and I was a disciple first of all. And what I later realized was that, due to the sort of political circumstances in the organization, that this was the only way that he could, so to speak, ensure that I would be taken care of and remain on his path. So I ended up staying for 20 more years, and most of my teaching career, if you want to call it that, took place during those 20 years. So it was, I am kind of a natural renunciant. It's not a big deal for me. I mean, once I left my 20s, and the path one follows in one's 20s, which I wouldn't say it was completely focused on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but there was, a certain amount of that, and a lot of serially monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. So when I entered the ashram, I felt like I had done a full worldly life, and that the choice I was making was, actually a fairly considered choice to restrict my outer commitments so that I could really focus on inwardness and service. So one of the things that motivates me, it's probably the main thing that motivates me as I look back on it, is that it's very important to me that what I do be useful, be of service, be helpful to, not so much to individuals as to society. And this is always a problem for me as a journalist, because I wasn't really a political or, social justice oriented writer. I was much more a writer about the culture, and I essentially didn't see that as particularly helpful. So I was always ambivalent about journalism, especially because then, as now, it usually, to be a journalist of the kind I was, I did a lot of articles about artists and actors and directors and etc. And what you were expected to do was kind of critique them, badmouth them, satirize them. And I found that very uncomfortable, because I was always very aware that the people I was writing about were people, So, and of course that situation has gotten much more intense today, but it was pretty intense in the 70s. So the idea of putting my communication skills into the service of the teacher who I saw literally transforming the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people, it just felt like the most worthwhile thing I could do. So that was what I was doing. That was why I entered that path, really for the sake of serving him.
Yeah, I have heard you refer to it as 30 years of obedience.
Did I say that?
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess one thing I want to ask you about that time, because you mentioned the time that you were teaching, and maybe this is for after you left the ashram. I don't know how much it changed.
My teaching?
Yeah, like I imagine it changed a lot.
Well, the thing is that the tradition, Muktananda's tradition, Siddha Yoga, it's a right-handed tantric tradition essentially, and in the panoply of Indian spirituality, there's a whole strain, as I'm sure you're familiar, of a certain kind of teaching that is devotional, that is non-dual, and that looks to find a balance between the inner and the outer, which I feel is essentially what Tantra is. It's devotional. It's at least the type of Tantra that I practice, non-dual Tantric Shaivism. It's non-dual, it's devotional, and it's also very much about finding a path that includes the world. So it's not a traditional transcendent, monk's journey at all, even though Muktananda was a sannyasin from the time he was 15. But he was also, by the time I met him, most of his devotees and students were householders. So his public teaching, at least, was live in the world, do your practice, deepen your engagement with the people and things you love, and essentially see God in all of it. And that, to me, is the heart of Tantra.
Interesting. So the outward teachings of Muktananda was householder path, but there was also an inside track of sannyasin that you were on.
Well, yeah, but so Muktananda's models really were the Ramakrishna order and Swami Shivananda of Rishikesh's order of monks, and he knew a lot of them. He was good friends with many of the Shivananda monks. Do you know that community? Yes,
I do.
Satchidananda, Vishnudevananda, Swami Chidananda was Swami Venkateshananda was a close friend of his. So he saw himself creating, a school in which the teachers would be monks, would be swamis, and everyone else would be a householder. So, in other words, the monks he created were teaching monks, which means that most of us were writers, professors, a couple of actors, people with communication skills who were kind of chosen for their intelligence and charisma. They weren't necessarily the most renounced people in his organization, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so it was very clear when I became a monk that it was part of a path that I was on, which was communicating and teaching what he had been teaching me, and in a sense training me in for all the years I was with him. And it honestly felt like, he'd taken care of me. He'd given me an extraordinary training in sadhana, as well as in the texts of the tradition. And I felt like, to be really blunt about it, I felt like I owed him my life. So that was my motivation.
Yeah, I've heard when Krishnadas was on and talked about his guru, he talked about him in the same regard.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, do you think that there's any contradiction behind the idea that someone who's a renunciate is teaching other people how to live in the world?
Well, it became an issue for me. So I'm just thinking in terms of Muktananda. Well, in India, this is very much the tradition, right? Household, most religious devotees are householders, and there's a long tradition of going to gurus. And it's not that all the gurus are swamis. Some of them are householders. Certainly Neem Karoli Baba was a householder. Mm-hmm. But the idea that you have this special life in an ashram where you go for a weekend or you go for a week and then you go back to your worldly life with grace and blessings, and you have an altar in your house, and you do whatever sadhana your guru has given you, which is a sadhana that works for householders. In other words, not an insane amount of practices. So he was very much in the tradition. And, as I've gotten to know other traditions, for instance, the Maharishi was a very similar kind of teacher, that he wasn't a monk. He always made the point that he was a brahmachari, not a swami. But most of his students were householders. And yet the teachers, as far as I've been able to tell, the people who were his main teachers were essentially living as renunciants, at least for, while he was still alive. And that's kind of the tradition. The teachers are meant to be clean of entanglement. So either you're a swami or you're in a traditional Indian marriage. There's not much room for, for the in between, the place I inhabit, for instance.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting turn of phrase, clean of entanglement.
Yeah.
I guess I have to ask, and I have to ask everyone, honestly, of your generation, because you were the folks who went to India and met the gurus. I didn't have a guru. I went to India to find a guru, and I didn't find one. I ended up kind of getting pointed on a more self-directed path because it had to be. Right. But I guess so many of the guru figures when I came into yoga in the early 90s, who were the revered masters, have fallen from some grace. And the question that I have is that, a lot of people feel that, and this is personal for me too, because one of my most influential teachers had scandals as well. And the idea is that, like, the education that people receive from gurus who have unaddressed abuse histories is somehow like compromised.
Well, I think it depends on the teacher and the circumstances and the person. I do think it's a case-by-case situation. I think that there's issues of culture. I think that there's a degree of moral panic in this country over sexuality, which lumps everything together. And I would say, I don't approve of teachers having sexual relationships with their students. I think it's often, not always, when you consider how many of them get married and have children and live happily ever after. But I think in general, it's damaging to the student. So I'm not condoning it as a general practice. But what I'm saying is that I'm not a person who's in a moral panic about sexuality. I think it's an aspect of the human being that's hugely significant and important, liable to be, leads us down some very weird paths, but also is one of the sources of bliss and joy. So in making a judgment about somebody's sexual practices, I think that, you always have to take it on an individual case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I'm not so interested in passing judgment on others. I'm one of those people who dated one of their students and then married them and has kids with them, and we've been together 18 years.
Right.
So I do have to say that as full disclosure. I would just say that there is a distinguishing thing for me, though. I've never set myself up as anybody else's guru. I think there is like hierarchical power structures
Of course there are. Of course there are.
That make a big difference as to whether or not you can remain clean of entanglement and still have healthy relations with students.
Yes, totally. So I mean, yes, there's a lot to say about it. I do believe that truly enlightened beings are operating from a different center than more ordinary teachers. And I know that that's a matter of argument. I know that particular teaching has been abused. I also think it's true that people have different, how shall I say, different strengths, different personality strengths. So one can be highly developed in some areas, not so developed in others. So there are a lot of factors here. And it is not a spiritually nourishing conversation. We exercise discernment in our teachers. But if we want to talk about the guru, I would like to talk about what the guru is really about. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. Honestly, I've had conversations about these abuse stories, and I don't know that they've always been very constructive. So I totally understand. I've tried to make them constructive, and sometimes there's something constructive about voicing things, but I hear what you're saying. What I did get from what you just said, and it's a good transition to where I had in mind for us to go somewhere. You talked about kind of operating from a different center. But real quick before we do that, I have this weekly teachers class that I have every week, and I have all these teachers. And when I mentioned to them last night I was talking to you, they all lit up like a number of them were students of yours. Oh. And I asked them, well, what do you want me to ask her? And they had this one thing I think might be a good transition to, or it's just a curiosity. And maybe it's a big topic, but I'm curious if you can give us a little bit of a kind of rough overview. They wanted to know about what your understanding of a yogic path of meditation is. Because I had Nishila Devi on a while back, and she wrote a book about this. And I believe you wrote a book about this. A lot of meditation out there is like Buddhist oriented, or like there's Zen meditation. And we've been talking about these ascetic traditions, and sometimes meditating is about like trying to transcend, and sometimes it's about getting here. So do you think that there's a distinctly yogic idea of meditation, and how does it differ from other types?
That's an interesting idea. Well, one of the characteristics of yoga, as you know, is that it's very technique driven. In other words, in the yoga tradition, there are so many techniques for changing your state, for transforming your body, for transforming your psyche. I would say that most yogic meditation, and I would include Vajrayana Buddhism in that category as well, which is a very yogic tradition. A lot of yogic meditation has to do with opening the subtle body. Certainly the chakras, but the chakras, the nadis. And when you do yogic meditation, when you do a committed path of yogic meditation, you're probably going to experiment with different techniques and practices along the way. And whereas in traditional Mahayana or Hinayana Buddhist practice, or even in some of the more transcendent-oriented direct path practices, the tendency would be to do the kind of practice where you're essentially meditating on awareness itself, in a very kind of one-pointed way, or following the breath in the more preliminary practices. But for instance, in tantric yogic practice, there's so many things you can do, and each of them has a slightly different effect on your subtle body. So to me, and I'm speaking for myself, the yogic path of meditation is an experimental path. It's based on this understanding that inside your human body is a laboratory for self-transformation. And you can work with different mantras, you can work with different visualizations, you can work with focusing on different centers in the body, and you can open these centers, you can open these aspects of yourself, And not only will you experience transcendent states, but you will eventually learn to experience a kind of walking, I call it walking around practice, where you're actually able to see through the forms of the world to the energy within them, because you've opened certain centers of perception within yourself. And I do believe that yogic meditation intends that, intends to unleash our superpowers, our innate superpowers, which to me are not so much powers to do as powers to perceive, in a deeper way.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.